That is enough. Leave her alone. Mind your own business.
The dust of the main street never settled, not really. It hung in the afternoon air, a golden haze stirred by the clomp of hooves and the scuff of worn boots, tasting of sweat, horseflesh, and the distant promise of rain. It was in this hazy, ordinary bustle of a nameless frontier town that ugliness decided to make its move. He was a man shaped by bad whiskey and a mean streak as wide as the river, his face flushed a blotchy red, his eyes glazed over with a poison that stripped away any pretense of civility. He moved through the market stalls with a lurching purpose, a predator's focus cutting through the crowd. His target was a woman who carried her silence like a shield. She was a recent widow, her dark dress a stark absence against the faded colors of dry goods and ripening fruit. Her hands, methodically checking the firmness of apples, were the only calm thing about her. Everyone knew her story, or a version of it. Everyone saw the quiet grief she wore, and in a town that respected strength, her vulnerability was a glaring, uncomfortable thing. The drunk man saw it too, but where others saw something to be politely ignored or quietly pitied, he saw an opportunity. His voice cut across the murmur of barter, a slurred and greasy thing that made nearby conversations stutter and die. He called out to her, not by name, but by a crude label that turned the watching faces grim. She didn't flinch, but her hand stilled on the apple she held. She kept her eyes on the fruit, a silent plea for the world to right itself, for him to stumble away, for someone, anyone, to speak up. The townsfolk, a collection of merchants and homesteaders, shifted their weight. Eyes dropped to study wagon wheels or the grain of wooden counters. A man cleared his throat but found no words to follow the sound. It was the old, familiar tragedy playing its first act. A spectacle of bullying where the audience's inaction became part of the script. Emboldened by the silence, the drunk closed the distance. His shadow fell over her, smelling of stale alcohol and aggression. He reached out, not for the apple, but for her arm, his fingers grasping with a claim she had not offered. This was the moment the town would later replay in whispers. This was the fracture in the ordinary day. She finally looked up, and in her eyes was not just fear, but a furious, helpless defiance. He leaned in, his words meant only for her, a low threat soaked in whiskey. It seemed the inevitable was about to unfold, another dark footnote in the ledger of a hard land. But the inevitable changed its course. From the periphery, a figure detached itself from the deep shade under the awning of the blacksmith's shop. He had been still for so long, watching with an unnerving patience, that he had seemed part of the architecture. He was an Apache, a man of the mountains and the endless desert, here in this clabbered town for reasons no one dared to ask. His presence was always noted, always calculated by the settlers. He wore simple, worn clothes of a white man's make, but they sat on him differently. His hair was long and dark, tied back. His face was a map of sunlines and a profound, unreadable calm. He moved without sound, a ripple of purposeful motion through the stagnant air of the crowded market. He did not shout, he did not run. He simply placed himself in the space between the widow and the drunk, his arrival as sudden and silent as a shadow crossing the sun. The drunk, confused by this new obstacle, blinked his watery eyes. "You get out of the way," he snarled, trying to peer around the broad shoulders now blocking his view. The Apache said nothing. He just stood, his posture neither aggressive nor submissive, but absolute. It was a wall, it was a boundary. The entire market had frozen, a diorama of held breaths. The widow, still clutching the apple, took a half-step back, her gaze locked on the back of the man who had intervened. Fury, hot and stupid, flooded the drunk's face. Being ignored by this man, in front of everyone, was a worse insult than any rebuttal. He made a grab, not for the widow, but for the Apache's shoulder, aiming to shove him aside. What happened next was too fast for most to follow. There was no dramatic fight, no drawn knife or gun. It was a blur of efficient, restrained motion. The Apache's hand shot up, catching the drunk's wrist in a grip that looked effortless but made the larger man gasp. With a subtle twist and a shift of his own weight, he used the drunk's momentum against him, sending him stumbling sideways to crash into a barrel of pickles with a wet, hollow thud. The drunk sprawled in the dirt, more shocked than hurt, the wind knocked from him along with his bravado. The silence that followed was heavier than before, electric and tense. It was no longer just about a drunk and a widow. It was about a line crossed, a balance upset. The Apache stood over the fallen man, looking down with an expression that held no anger, only a cool, distant assessment, like a man observing a dangerous but simple-minded animal. He then turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at the widow. Their eyes met for a fractured second. In his, she saw no offer of friendship, no gentle reassurance. She saw only an acknowledgment of a wrong that had been stopped. In hers, he saw the storm of shock, gratitude, and a new, different fear. He had pulled her from one fire and thrown her into a different kind of furnace. For now, the immediate threat was sitting in pickle brine, coughing and sputtering. But as the Apache turned his gaze from the woman to scan the faces of the crowd, he saw the new danger forming. The initial shock on the settlers' faces was hardening into something else. A man had been humiliated. And the man who had done it was an outsider, one they already feared and misunderstood. Hands, which had been idle during the assault, now drifted closer to belt lines where pistols hung. Whispers, sharper than before, cut through the air. The sheriff was nowhere in sight. The drunk was starting to move, a low groan building into a roar of outrage. He was their problem. They're kind of ugly. The Apache's intervention was a spark in a tinder-dry field. The Apache understood this calculus of violence better than anyone present. He had not sought a fight, but he had accepted its possibility the moment he moved. He took one slow step back, then another, positioning himself not in flight, but with the wall of the blacksmith shop at his back. His right hand did not go for a weapon, but rested lightly on his thigh, ready. The message was clear. He would not be the one to start it, but he would not be run down. The drunk was climbing to his feet, his rage finding a fresh target, fueled now by the scowls of his fellow townsmen. The widow stood trapped between them all, the original offense almost forgotten, the apple forgotten in her hand. The standoff was no longer about an assault. It was about pride, territory, and the deep, simmering fear of the unknown. No one moved, but the air itself seemed to crackle, waiting for the single, foolish action that would turn this sun-drenched market into a killing ground. And in that suspended, breathless moment, the only certainty was that the next move would change everything, and blood, once promised, was now just a heartbeat away. The world had shrunk to that dusty patch of ground between the barrel and the blacksmith's wall. The Apache man, whose name was not spoken in this town, felt the shift in the air as keenly as a change in the wind. It was no longer a single drunk's poison, but a collective heat rising from the crowd. He saw it in the narrowed eyes of the grocer, a man who had always given him fair weight for his pelts, but now looked at him like a stranger. He saw it in the way the blacksmith, a giant of a man with forearms like knotted wood, wiped his hands slowly on his leather apron and took a single, solid step forward from the doorway of his shop. The drunk was on his knees now, swearing and wiping pickle brine from his eyes, his humiliation a seed that was already sprouting into something uglier and shared. "That's enough now," the voice belonged to the harness maker, an older fellow with a face like worn saddle leather. He wasn't talking to the drunk, he was looking straight at the Apache. "You've had your say. Best you move on?" It was a gentle suggestion wrapped in a hard meaning. The message was clear: you don't belong in our trouble. The widow, forgotten for a moment in the new tension, found her voice. It was quiet, but it cut. "He was helping me." Her words hung there, a fragile truth that seemed to irritate the men more than calm them. "Ain't nobody said he wasn't," the blacksmith rumbled, his eyes never leaving the Apache. "But we handle our own." And that was the heart of it. The drunk, rising unsteadily to his feet, was theirs. He was a nuisance, a failure, a familiar face who owed money at the saloon and cheated at cards. But he was one of them. The man who stood with his back to the sun-bleached wall was not. He was a question mark. His people, from the high deserts and the canyons to the south, were a subject of fear and grim stories told around cookfires. His presence in town was tolerated barely because he came alone, traded quietly, and caused no fuss. Until now he had changed the story. He had made himself the main character in a drama where he was supposed to be part of the scenery. The Apache, whom some of the older Mexicans in the market called El Silencio for his quiet ways, understood the language of mobs. He had seen it before in other places with other faces. It started with a look, then a gathering, then a single pushed man becoming a pushing crowd. He let his gaze travel slowly over the men edging closer. He did not look afraid, he looked prepared. His stillness was a direct challenge to their restless energy. He knew that to run would be to trigger the chase. To show fear would be to confirm their power. So he stood, a statue of watchful patience, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the widow, caught between him and the crowd, her face pale under her bonnet. He saw the drunk, now standing with a friend's hand on his arm, whispering furiously and pointing. He saw the sheriff, finally, a tall man with a silver star, shouldering his way through the onlookers from the far end of the street. Relief was not a feeling he allowed himself. A badge did not always mean justice. Sometimes it just meant official trouble. "Break it up! What's all this?" The sheriff called out, his voice carrying the practiced weariness of a man who broke up too many foolish fights. The crowd parted for him, a chorus of voices rising to explain. The drunk's was the loudest, a blustering tale of an unprovoked attack by a wild Injun. The widow's was a soft counterpoint, ignored by most. The sheriff held up a hand, his eyes taking in the scene, the angry drunk, the trembling woman, the Apaches standing like a rock in a stream, and the palpable hunger for a conclusion in the faces of his townsfolk. He walked first to the drunk. "You causing problems again?" he asked, his tone flat. The drunk began to splutter a denial, but the sheriff cut him off. "I ain't interested. Get over to the jail and sleep it off." Now, it was not a request. With a final, venomous glare at the Apache, the drunk allowed himself to be led away by a deputy, his departure taking a great deal of the immediate heat with him. The sheriff then turned to the widow. "Ma'am, you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of hollow courtesy. Then, finally, he faced the Apache. The market fell silent again, waiting for the judgment. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. He knew this man, or knew of him. He paid for his goods with silver, not promises. He camped alone in the scrub outside town, never causing a stir. But today he had stirred the pot to a boil. "You," the sheriff said, his voice lower now, meant for fewer ears. "You know you can't be doing that." The Apache said nothing. His silence was infuriating to the crowd, but the sheriff seemed to understand it was not defiance. It was simply how the man was. "That fella's a nobody," the sheriff continued, stepping a little closer. "But he's a nobody from here. You lay hands on him, even if he deserves it, and it becomes a thing, you understand? It becomes a thing." He stressed the word, meaning a problem that wouldn't go away. A story that would grow in the retelling, a reason for men with rifles and old grudges to come looking. Still, the Apache remained silent. He gave a single, slow nod. He understood. He had understood before he ever moved from the shadows. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He was in an impossible spot. The man hadn't broken a law, not really. He'd probably prevented one. But the peace of his town felt frayed and fragile. "I'm gonna say this once. You finish your business here today, then you go. Don't come back for a while. Let this settle." It was an exile, quiet and unofficial. A safety measure. For who, the sheriff wasn't entirely sure. For the first time the Apache spoke. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse, his words precise. "My business is finished." He had come to trade for bullets and flour. It could wait. He took a step away from the wall, and the crowd instinctively drew back, creating a path. He moved with that same unhurried grace, his eyes sweeping across them one last time, a quiet warning in itself. His gaze paused on the widow for a fraction of a second, a look that held no comfort, only a grim acknowledgment of the world's way. Then he walked, not toward the saloon or the general store, but straight down the main street toward the open desert beyond. The crowd watched him go, a mix of relief and unresolved anger lingering like the dust. The show was over, but nobody felt satisfied. The widow stood alone, the sheriff having moved on to disperse the others. She looked down at her hands and saw she still held the apple, her fingers having pressed small, bruised crescents into its red skin. She felt no victory, only a hollow, shaky feeling. The man who had helped her was banished, and she was left with the cold understanding that her safety was a fleeting, conditional thing. She had been saved, but at a cost she couldn't yet measure. As the market's noise slowly returned to a nervous hum, two men lingered by the water trough, their voices low. One was the blacksmith. The other was a lean, hawk-faced man who ran freight wagons south. The hawk-faced man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, watching the distant figure of the Apache grow smaller on the road. "Quiet one, ain't he?" the freighter said. "Too quiet," the blacksmith replied, his massive arms crossed. "He's got a reason for being around these parts, and it ain't just for trading. Ain't many of his people come this far north alone, not anymore." "Not since the Troubles," the freighter nodded slowly, a thought forming. "You hear about that army payroll wagon that went missing last month, over near Soldiers Canyon?" The blacksmith's eyes narrowed. He had heard. Everyone had heard. A guarded wagon, 2 soldiers dead, the strongbox gone without a trace. The army had scoured the canyons, finding nothing but empty silence and a few cold campfires. They'd blamed renegade bands, but nothing was proven. The two men looked at each other, then back down the empty road where the Apache had vanished into the shimmering heat. A solitary man, skilled, moving through country few others knew. A man who didn't flinch from violence. The pieces were all there, loose and unconnected. But in a town hungry for a story that could make sense of today's disruption and their own collective shame, those pieces began, slowly, to click together in their minds. The stranger wasn't just a problem anymore. In the quiet of their suspicions, he was becoming the answer to a different, darker question. And questions like that had a way of drawing men out into the desert, with ropes and rifles, looking for a truth they'd already decided to find. The sun began its long crawl toward the rim of the distant mountains, stretching shadows across the town like dark fingers. In the widow's small cabin on the edge of the settlement, the silence felt different. It was no longer a companion to her grief, but a heavy, listening thing. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of the sagebrush outside her window, seemed to carry a question. She had put the bruised apple on her table. It sat there, a quiet accusation. She had thanked no one, and no one had come to check on her. The sheriff's order for the Apache to leave was the town's final word on the matter. By helping her, he had made himself the problem, and by solving that problem, they could pretend the original ugliness never happened. It was a logic that left her cold and deeply alone. She knew the looks. She had seen them as she hurried home, the averted glances that were somehow worse than the drunk's leering. They were looks that said she had brought trouble, that her quiet presence had somehow summoned a storm. A good woman, they seemed to think, would have found a less dramatic way to handle it. A smarter woman wouldn't have been there at all. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, a cleaner fire than her sorrow. For the first time since burying her husband, a feeling sharper than grief took hold, a fierce, lonely anger. And beneath that, a gnawing worry for the silent man who had stepped into the path of that trouble. His exile felt like a debt she now carried. Across town, in the dusty gloom of the jailhouse, the sheriff poured himself a cup of bitter coffee. The drunk, whose name was Clyde, snored loudly in the single cell, stinking of brine and whiskey. The deputy, a young man with eager eyes, leaned against the doorframe. "You really think he'll just stay gone, Sheriff? That Apache?" The sheriff sipped his coffee, wincing at the heat and the taste. "I think he's a practical man." He saw the mood. "He'll steer clear. Folks are talking, though," the deputy pressed. "Blacksmith and that freighter, Jenks, they got ideas. They're saying a man that calm in a fight, that knows the back country like he does. Well, it's peculiar. Makes you wonder what else he knows." The sheriff set his cup down hard. "I know what they're wondering. And I'm telling you, and I'll tell them we got enough trouble without going hunting for phantoms. That payroll wagon is army business. Not ours. But what if it ain't a phantom?" The deputy said, his voice dropping. "What if he's the one? All that silver just vanished, and then he shows up here with coin to spend. It adds up." That was the trouble, the sheriff thought. It did add up. It added up to a neat, satisfying story for men who wanted a villain, especially one who wasn't from around here. He had nothing to tie the stranger to that robbery, not a single shred of proof. But suspicion in a small town was a weed that needed no soil to grow. He had sent the man away to cool tempers, but he might have just poured oil on the simmering suspicions of men like Jenks. He looked out the small, grimy window. The main street was quiet, but the peace felt brittle, like thin ice. Out on the freight road, the man called El Silencio walked. He did not look back. The town was a speck behind him, a place of noise and confusing rules. His mind was not on the drunk or the sheriff or the widow's pale, shocked face. It was on the trail ahead, and on the reason he was in this hard country in the first place. It had nothing to do with army silver. His purpose was older and more personal. He was searching, not for treasure, but for a sign, a trace of people who should have been here. His people. A small band, a family group, who had slipped away from the reservation, seeking the old ways, and had vanished into the vastness. He had been tracking them for weeks, finding only faint signs and dead ends. The trail had grown cold near these very hills. His supplies were low, which was why he had risked the town. Now that option was closed. He found his camp, a simple affair hidden in a dry wash a few miles out. A bedroll, a small, cold fire pit, a water skin, and his rifle. He gathered his things with swift, efficient movements. The sheriff's warning was wise. He would not return to that town, but his search was not over. He had a new direction to try, a canyon to the west that whispered of hidden springs and old shelters. As he tightened the straps on his pack, his eyes scanned the horizon. He was not just looking for landmarks. He was watching for dust. The men in that town had the look of hounds that had caught a scent. Sometimes such men could not leave a trail alone. Back in the saloon, as lanterns were lit against the falling dusk, the story was being rewritten. Clyde the drunk, once an object of disgust, was now a pitiable figure in his own telling, a man set upon by a savage without cause. The blacksmith and Jenks the freighter held court at a corner table, their voices a low, serious rumble that drew others in. "Ain't about the scuffle," Jenks was saying, tracing a line in the wet ring of his beer glass. "It's about the pattern. Soldier's Canyon is 2 days' hard ride south. A man on foot, knowing the land, could make it in 3. He's been here, what, a week?" "Timing fits," a farmer leaned in. "But the army searched that whole area. Found nothing." "The army searches like a blind mule," the blacksmith said, his voice like grinding stones. "They look for armies, not for one man. One man who can disappear." He looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes. "Think on it. Where's his loyalty? Not to this town? Not to any flag we fly? He follows his own law. The law that says a strong box of silver is there for the taking." The logic was circular and perfect. The stranger's calm strength, his otherness, his convenient presence, it all became proof. The missing payroll was a festering sore on the community's pride, a reminder of the lawlessness that always threatened to swallow them. Here was a culprit who made sense. The fact that they had no evidence became, in their minds, a testament to his cunning. "What do we do?" the farmer asked, a gleam in his eye that was part fear, part excitement. "We don't do anything reckless," Jenks said, but his tone suggested recklessness was exactly what he was contemplating. "But a group of concerned citizens, men who know this land, might take a ride, just to look. If we found something, well, the army would be mighty grateful. There's likely a reward." The word reward hung in the smoky air, changing everything. It was no longer about justice or safety. It was about opportunity. It was about turning fear and suspicion into profit. The blacksmith gave a slow nod. The plan was unspoken but formed. They would get a few more reliable men. They would ride out at first light, not toward the main road, but into the broken country where a man might hide. The widow, in her cabin, heard the occasional burst of loud talk from the saloon drift on the night wind. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. It was the sound of men convincing themselves of something. She blew out her lamp and sat in the dark by the window, the vast, star-dusted sky looming over the dark shapes of the town's buildings. She thought of the Apache's eyes, that flat, assessing look that had seen everything in that moment, her fear. The crowd's cowardice, the drunk's malice. He had understood it all, and he had acted anyway. And for that, he was now a quarry. A deep, unsettling conviction settled in her. The town had chosen its side. It had chosen the comfort of an easy villain over the messy truth. And she, by being the cause of it all, was now on the other side. She was alone with a secret gratitude that felt dangerous. She did not know his name or where he was or what he truly was. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that men were coming for him, and she knew that the debt she owed could not be paid by sitting quietly in the dark. The night stretched ahead, long and full of tension. Two parties separated by miles of darkness, one man moving silently under the stars, pursued by a story that was growing legs and teeth with every passing hour, and one woman sitting in a silent cabin, knowing she was perhaps the only soul in that town who knew the story was a lie. What that knowledge would demand of her, she did not yet know. But the pressure of it built in the quiet room, a silent scream waiting for the dawn. The night was a vast cool bowl over the desert, and the man moved through it like a shadow. He was not sleeping. The instincts that had kept him alive in a world that wanted men like him gone were humming, a low current beneath his skin. The town's anger was a tangible thing he had left behind, but the memory of the men's eyes, the way they had looked at him not with the simple dislike of a stranger, but with the new, sharp glint of an idea, told him their trouble was not finished. He had broken camp completely, leaving no sign he had ever been in the dry wash. His path now was a winding one, over rocky ground that would take no imprint, a ghost's route toward the high canyons. He was thinking of the missing ones, the family band he sought. The trail was old and confused, but he had found a child's small footprint. Weeks faded, near a seep spring, not far from here. It was the sign that had brought him to this territory. They were out here, scared, hungry, trying to remember how to live in a world that had fenced the old life away. His search for them was a thread of purpose in a lonely existence. The town, its silver, its drunken men, and its fearful whispers were nothing. Less than nothing. But he knew how such whispers could turn into actions. Actions traveled on horseback, and they traveled fast. As the first gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky, the town stirred. At the livery stable, 5 men gathered. Jenks the freighter, the blacksmith, the young deputy whose name was Eli, and 2 others, a homesteader with a grudge against anyone not on a deed, and a mule skinner known for his sharp eyes and poor temper. They were a grim committee, armed with rifles and canteens and the solid conviction of their own reasoning. The sheriff stood in the doorway of his office, watching them tighten saddle cinches. His face was like stone. "You boys are chasing a ghost with a pocketful of someone else's story," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. Jenks swung up into his saddle. "We're just gonna look, Sheriff. Do a citizen's duty. If we see something, we'll report it. Proper. And if you don't see something?" the sheriff asked, pinning the young deputy with a look. "You planning on making something up out of dust and bad feeling?" Deputy Eli looked away, color in his cheeks. "We're just looking." The sheriff knew he could not stop them. They were not breaking a law by riding out. He could only hope the desert would be empty, that they would get bored, sunburned, and come home with nothing but thirst. But the set of Jenks's jaw, the eager light in the homesteader's eye, told a different story. They wanted to find something, and men who wanted to find something bad enough usually did, whether it was there or not. He watched them ride out, a tight knot of purpose, kicking up a low cloud of dust that hung in the still morning air. The widow saw them leave from her window. She had been awake all night, the weight of her knowledge a physical ache. Seeing them, their rifles like spines against the light, made the decision for her. It was a mad thought, born of sleeplessness and a debt that gnawed at her. She could not outride them. She knew nothing of tracking. But she knew the general direction the Apache had taken when he left town west into the broken lands. And she knew something the men did not. There was an old trapper's trail, overgrown and treacherous, that cut a crooked path up into those canyons from the north side. Her husband had shown it to her once, a lifetime ago. It was a longer, harder route, but it came out high above the main washes. It was a foolish, dangerous thing, a woman alone. But the thought of staying, of waiting to hear the shots echo back from the hills, was worse. She dressed quickly in her toughest dress and her husband's old too-large coat. She filled a canteen, shoved some hard bread into a pocket, and slipped out the back. Her old mare was in the small corral. The horse was gentle and steady, not built for speed, but for endurance. It would have to be enough. The Apache had reached the mouth of the canyon he sought. It was a gash in the earth, walls of red rock rising steeply, dotted with stubborn pines. Here the air was cooler. He moved with absolute silence, his eyes reading the ground, the scatter of pebbles, the bent grasses, and then he found it. Not the sign he was hoping for, the sign he dreaded. Fresh tracks, shod horses, at least 4. They were not army tracks. The pattern was mixed, civilian. They were coming up the main wash, the easy way into the canyon. They were not lost. They were hunting. A cold stillness settled over him. They were a day behind him, maybe less if they pushed hard. They were in his territory now, but they had numbers and they had the reckless confidence of a pack. He could melt away, disappear into the maze of side canyons and high shelves where no horse could follow. That was the smart thing, the only thing. But to do so would be to abandon this canyon, this specific search. The child's footprint had been near here. If his people were hiding in this labyrinth, the noise and violence of a posse would flush them out, or worse, trap them. He could not lead that kind of trouble to their doorstep. He had to deal with this, not with fighting if he could help it, but with a message, a warning so clear they would turn back. He began to climb, finding handholds in the rock face that seemed invisible from below. He needed height. He needed to see. The widow's path was agony. The old trail was barely a memory, choked with catclaw and loose scree. Her mare picked its way carefully, snorting in protest. Sweat soaked through her clothes, and fear was a constant taste in her mouth. What was she doing? She was no one. She had no power. She could not stand between armed men and their target, but she had to try. If she could find him first, warn him. It was a thin hope, fraying with every difficult step. Jenks and his men made good time. The canyon floor was sandy but flat. They rode with their rifles across their saddles, eyes scanning the walls. The blacksmith, his bulk uncomfortable on a horse, was the first to voice the doubt creeping in. Place is big. He could be anywhere. He's here, Jenks said, his hawk face sharp with certainty. A man like that doesn't run to open ground, he runs to cover. This is his cover, he pointed to a disturbed patch of sand. See there? A moccasin print, fresh? It was. The Apache, in his initial search, had not bothered to hide his early tracks. The men saw it as confirmation. The thrill of the hunt went through them like a current. Deputy Eli licked his lips, his hand tight on his rifle stock. High above them, perched on a rocky ledge like a part of the stone itself, the Apache watched. He saw them clearly, 5 men strung out in the wash below. He saw the way they studied his old track. He saw the homesteader point up toward a side canyon, the wrong one. Good, let them waste time. He picked up a stone about the size of his fist. He weighed it in his palm. Then, with a smooth, powerful motion born of a lifetime using a sling, he hurled it. He did not aim at the men. The stone flew in a high, silent arc and landed with a sharp, shocking crack on a slab of rock 20 yards ahead of the riders and just as far to their right. The sound echoed in the canyon like a gunshot. The men jerked, horses shying. They swung their rifles toward the sound, searching the empty cliffs. "What was that?" the mule skinner hissed. "Rockfall." "Natural," said the homesteader, but his voice was unsure. The Apache picked up another stone. He waited. As the men, talking in low, tense voices, began to move forward again, he threw. This one struck another rock, this time directly to their left and slightly behind them. The reaction was immediate. The men spun, rifles coming up. "Someone's up there!" Deputy Eli yelled, his voice too high. "Show yourself!" Jenks shouted, his words bouncing off the canyon walls. Only the echo answered. From his vantage, the Apache could see the fear take root. They were exposed in the wash, a canyon corridor with 1,000 hiding places above them. They were no longer hunters. They were targets in a shooting gallery they couldn't see. The blacksmith was looking back the way they came, his face pale. The widow heard the echoes. The sharp reports of stone on stone carried surprisingly far in the clear, thin air. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was close. She had come out on a high bench that overlooked the main canyon, though she couldn't see the floor from her position. The sounds came from below and ahead. The men had found him, or he had found them. She urged her tired Mary forward, the path now leading down in a treacherous slope toward the sound. Down in the wash, the tension was a wire about to snap. The men had bunched together, their horses turning nervous circles. "This is fool's work," the blacksmith muttered. He's baiting us. He's one man, Jenks snapped, but his eyes darted ceaselessly over the rimrock. He's trying to scare us off. Another stone, this one smaller, landed in the sandy wash itself, right between two of the horses. It was not a violent act. It was a statement. I can place a rock where I want. I could place a bullet. That was enough for the homesteader. I didn't sign up for an ambush, he said, yanking his horse's head around. I'm going back. You stay in line, Jenks commanded, but the group's will was breaking. The mule skinner was backing his horse up, his rifle pointed uselessly at the sheer cliff face. It was then that the widow's marae, picking its way down the loose slope, dislodged a small cascade of pebbles. The sound was different from the sharp cracks of the thrown stones. It was a gritty, tumbling whisper. Every man below, and the man above, heard it. All heads turned, all rifles swung as one toward the new sound halfway up the north wall. They saw the movement, the figure on the horse outlined against the sky. There! Shouted Deputy Eli, and in the panic and the confusion, in the flood of relief at having a target at last, he did not see a coat or a dress. He saw a shape. He saw the enemy who had been toying with him. His finger, already tight on the trigger, jerked. The shot was a thunderclap in the confined space. The widow's mare screamed, rearing. She felt the world tilt, the sky and rock swapping places. She had a single, crystal-clear view of the men below, their faces upturned, frozen in shock. She saw a puff of dust where the bullet struck the rock beside her. And then she was falling, the saddle slipping away from her, the canyon wall rushing up to meet her in a blur of pain and terror. The last thing she heard, echoing over the ringing in her ears, was not the shouted curses of the men, but a different sound, a raw, fierce cry that was not of fear, but of fury, tearing down from the rocks high above. It was the sound of the silent man breaking his silence, and it held the promise of a storm that would not be stopped with stones. The world stopped in the echoing wake of the gunshot. The widow lay in a crumpled heap against a rough outcrop, the wind knocked from her lungs, a sharp, hot pain screaming from her ankle. Her marae, wild-eyed, scrambled away down the slope. Below, the men were frozen, the reality of what had just happened dawning on their faces. Deputy Eli stared at the smoking rifle in his hands as if it had bitten him. Then, movement. Not from the widow and not from the men. From high above, on the opposite wall, a figure detached itself from the stone and began to descend. It was not a climb. It was a fall made purposeful, a controlled slide of dust and dislodged rocks, a direct, ruthless line toward the canyon floor. The Apache hit the sand in a low crouch, and then he was running, not toward the men and their guns, but in a wide, swift arc that put him at the base of the slope where the widow had fallen. Jenks, recovering from his shock, swung his rifle toward this new, clear target. "Hold it right there!" The Apache did not hold it. He did not even look at them. His entire focus was on the slope. He scrambled up the loose rock with a speed that seemed impossible, closing the distance to the widow in moments. He knelt beside her, his back to the men below, a gesture of such profound disregard for their threat that it left them speechless. The widow looked up, pain and fear clouding her vision. She saw his face no longer calm but set in lines of fierce concentration. "My ankle," she managed to gasp. His hands were swift and sure, probing the injury through her boot. "Not broken." "Bad twist." His voice was low, final. He then looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "Why are you here?" "They were coming," she said, the words tumbling out. "I heard them plan. I had to warn you." He absorbed this, a woman. A white woman from the town that hated him had ridden into this danger to deliver a warning he already knew. Something shifted in his eyes, a crack in the impassive mask. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgment of a debt that now ran both ways. Down in the wash, the tableau held. The blacksmith's massive hand closed over the barrel of Jenks's rifle, pushing it down. "Look at what you fools have done," he growled, his voice thick with shame. "You shot at a woman." He looked at the deputy, whose face was now ashen. "You shot at a woman, Eli." The fight had gone out of Jenks. The righteous hunt had curdled into something ugly and plain. They had come for a phantom thief and had nearly killed a widow over it. The story they had told themselves lay in ruins around them. The Apache helped the widow to her feet, supporting her weight. She cried out as her ankle took pressure, and instinctively he shifted, half carrying her as they began a slow, careful descent back toward the canyon floor. He was bringing her right to them. The men watched, hands slack on their weapons, unsure of what to do. When they reached the sandy bottom, the Apache stopped, keeping himself between the widow and the others. He faced them, his arm still supporting her. His gaze swept over each man, and each found they could not hold it. "The payroll wagon," the Apache said, his voice cutting the silence. "You look for it?" Jenks, defiant to the last, jutted his chin. "We got a right to be curious." From inside his worn shirt, the Apache pulled not a weapon, but a small folded piece of brittle paper. He held it out. After a moment, the blacksmith stepped forward and took it. It was a wanted dodger, weathered and old. The sketch on it was of a white man, bearded, with a scar over one eye. The writing described a notorious road agent known to work the southern trails. "He has a hideout 2 canyons south of Soldiers Canyon," the Apache said. "The army does not look in the right places. I saw his sign weeks ago, fresh. He was alone. The army looks for many men. That is why they find nothing." The blacksmith stared at the paper, then at the Apache. "You're just carrying this around?" "I look for my family," the Apache said, and for the first time a sliver of his own truth showed. "A small band. I track them. I see many things. I see this man's trail. It is not my business." He paused, letting the implication hang. Their business had been a fantasy. His was a real, quiet search. The shame deepened among the men. They had concocted a villain out of thin air while the real one was out there. And this man, whom they had hounded, had the answer in his pocket and had not bothered with it because he was on a different path entirely. The widow spoke then, her voice weak but clear. "He helped me when none of you would, and you ran him out for it. And then you came to kill him for a story." It was the plain, unvarnished truth. There was no arguing with it. Jenks looked at the ground. The deputy looked like he might be sick. The Apache shifted, looking at the blacksmith. "Her horse is gone. She cannot walk." It was not a request. It was a statement of problem that now belonged to them. The blacksmith nodded, a heavy, final motion. "We'll get her home." He moved toward the widow, his manner suddenly gentle. "Ma'am, let me help." She hesitated, then allowed the blacksmith to take her weight from the Apache. The transfer was a silent treaty. The Apache took a step back, away from the group, back toward the canyon wall. "You," the widow said, turning her head to look at him. "Your search? Your family." He met her eyes. "I will continue. I hope you find them," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. He gave that same slow nod. Then he looked at the men one last time. "The paper. Give it to the sheriff." He turned and began to walk away, not back up the cliffs, but down the canyon, continuing his solitary journey. They watched him go, the silent man who had been their monster, until he rounded a bend and was gone, leaving only the quiet of the rocks and their own loud thoughts. The ride back to town was long and somber. The widow rode before the blacksmith on his big horse, her injured foot resting awkwardly. No one spoke much. The story they would have to tell was not the one they had planned. When they reached the sheriff's office, the whole town seemed to be waiting. The sheriff helped the widow down, his face grim as he listened to the blacksmith's low, earnest account. He took the wanted dodger, his eyes widening slightly. Days later, the widow sat on the porch of her cabin, her foot propped on a stool. The town's mood had changed. The blacksmith had brought her firewood. The grocer's wife had come by with a pot of stew. The shame of their collective failure had softened into a clumsy, earnest effort to make things right. The sheriff had organized a proper posse, using the information from the Dodger, and had ridden out to find the real road agent. The story of the payroll wagon had a new, legitimate chapter. But for the widow, the real story was the quiet one. It was about the choice to step forward and the chain of consequences it set in motion. She had learned the weight of her own voice. The town had learned the cost of a careless story. And somewhere out in the vast Red Rock canyons, a man continued his search, a little less alone because of a debt acknowledged in a moment of danger. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, she looked out toward the western hills. She would never see him again. She did not know his name. but she knew what he was. He was not a phantom or a thief. He was a man. And in a world quick to forget that simple truth, their brief, tangled paths had reminded a whole town of it. The memory held no fear now, only a strange, solid peace. She went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in her cabin felt like her own.